Hello, my name is Madeline Lee, and this is my presentation on my paper, The Development of Emotion and Motivation Throughout Childhood, Cross-Cultural Considerations and Implications for Educational Practices. To begin, I wanted to introduce a little bit about myself and my project. My name is Madeline Lee. I'm a senior at Concordia International School, Hanoi, based in Hanoi, Vietnam. But I'm originally from the East Coast in the United States, and I come from a Korean background. My mentor for this project was Isabella Spalding, and a little bit about why I chose this project is as a TCK and an aspiring educator, I wanted to look at how culture can impact learning, more specifically through the lens of emotion and motivation, hence how this paper came about. So first of all, I wanted to touch on two aspects of this project's relevancy. First is how emotion and motivation affect a student's learning. So it's very clear how a student's motivation drives their effort to learn and drives their thoughts and actions to obtain academic success. But when it comes to emotion, it's a really important and key part of early childhood development. And then it's also something that is extremely necessary for social situations such as attending school and interacting with peers. So now, why is it important to look at this from a cross-cultural perspective? Despite educational implications having an impact on children around the world, very few studies have actually focused on cross-cultural work. Henrich and his colleagues in 2010 coined the acronym WEIRD, which stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic, to highlight the lack of diversity in research participants in the field of psychology. Specifically in metacognitive neuroscience research, white and European American participants were studied 4 times more than their counterparts. Because of this, no hypotheses can be developed or inferences can be drawn if the entirety or majority of the data is based on a set group of people. Although there's so much more work that needs to be conducted in this area with cross-cultural research, this paper highlights the existing work in this field. So I first decided to study emotion and separated it into two sections, vocal emotion and visual. Beginning with vocal emotion, where culture comes into play is around at 4 years old, children begin to adopt social norms. So what's a social norm? A social norm is a socially determined standard that indicates behaviors that are considered typical in certain contexts. Each culture has its own values, mannerisms, and history, therefore creating its own social norm. At around 4 years old, this is where social norms and culture starts to play a part in emotional processing, identification, and expression. Amongst the research that I looked at, one clear thing that I found was the presence of an in-group advantage. A study conducted by Kronacki discovered that when listening to the audio of a native language, accuracy almost doubled, showing an in-group advantage. I also found that when identifying the differences between a negative emotion and a positive emotion, that negative emotions were identified more accurately than positive emotions. A study by Locke in 2021 hypothesized that this may be because there's a biological or innate reaction to threats that negative emotions may convey. This is opposed to positive emotions, which they claim are more influenced by culture and social cues. Moving on to visual emotion. So this is the identification of things like facial features, facial expressions, and eye contact. So I began this research by looking at past work. The expression of emotion in man and animals was first published by Charles Darwin in 1872. This publication first sparked the conversation of nature versus nurture and its influence on the expression of facial features and emotions. So when looking at this from the perspective of nature or what's innate, many of the visual studies have found that there are 6 universal emotions that are expressed. And a study, again, similar to that of vocal emotion found that it's really important to look at this from a biological perspective, stating that there are fundamental facial muscles responsible for creating these facial expressions, and that is linked to basic emotions remaining consistent among many different cultures and people groups. Now, when looking at this from a nurture perspective, similar to that of vocal emotion, there is an apparent in-group advantage. So a study conducted by Alterbia and colleagues in 2003 found that African American and white participants demonstrated a higher accuracy when looking at pictures of people from their own race and their own culture. Although I wasn't able to include every aspect and element of visual emotional processing in this paper, there was one paper that I wanted to highlight. So it was conducted by Adams and their colleagues in 2010, which studied the effect of direct versus averted eye gaze in the context of processing fear in students. So this is eye contact. Participants showed heightened amygdala activation when their members of their in-group, so people from their same culture, looked away compared to when looking at them, suggesting an increased emotional response linked to caution during averted gaze. So when people of their own people group were looking away from them, it seemed to heighten their amygdala activation. However, when individuals from an out-group outside of their culture looked directly at the participants, their amygdala exhibited stronger activation, possibly indicating an intensified emotional reaction tied to perceived threat or unfamiliarity. Now, moving on to motivation, rooted deep within the anatomy of individuals, motivation encompasses a multitude of factors that initiate, sustain, and direct our behaviors to obtain our goals. Considering this topic from a cross-cultural perspective allows one to learn about the values and the very basis of cultures. When looking at intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, although the development of motivation in a child may seem to strongly rely on intrinsic motivation, for instance, a newborn baby is typically drawn to their mother as they provide safety and food, while they are deterred from the sound of a growling dog. Extrinsic motivation plays a pivotal factor. Young children are intrinsically or naturally motivated to explore and engage in the world around them. But without extrinsic motivation, such as the praise from a caregiver, their brains will cease to prompt them to repeat any of these actions. Now, looking at this and where and how culture influences this is the presence of collectivist versus individualistic cultures. So those from non-Western cultures tend to have a stronger value of interconnectedness and perseverance in the hope of bettering the group. In these countries, there's less intrinsic motivation to make choices, as it may pose as a threat to the well-being of not only themselves, but their community as a whole. These deep-rooted values are reflected in all aspects of life, including education, where pleasing one's family or community is more motivating than making a personal choice. So what are the importance of all these findings, especially in the field of education? So when it comes to diversity in a diverse community such as that of a classroom, understanding how culture affects these topics is essential in understanding students. This is particularly relevant for students and educators in the United States, as according to the National Center of Education Statistics, found that in 2023, over 50% of students attending public school are people of color with varying backgrounds, and the exact demographics are presented on the screen. So when it comes to emotion, discipline is a large part of early education and even life. But what happens when a student isn't able to fully process why they're being disciplined, or if they're being disciplined at all? Different cultures may be more or less familiar with certain facial expressions or vocal tones. For instance, a teacher might pull aside a student to talk about their lack of enthusiasm and participation in class, but it may turn out that a student is actually really passionate about learning, but their more reserved and stoic presentation is how they demonstrate respect in their culture. So in a classroom context, it's really important to understand some of maybe these communication barriers that may come with the young age of students and even the cultural backgrounds. And this highlights the importance of clarification and clear communication amongst teachers. When it comes to motivation, similar to the development of emotion processing, motivation is highly influenced by external factors such as culture. Whether this motivation is intrinsic or extrinsic greatly impacts the situation and the emotions surrounding it. It can be traced back to cultural values, as I mentioned about a more collectivist versus individualistic community. For example, a student might feel a lot of stress in a certain class because of parental pressure and the value and the need to please and meet the standard and expectations of their community. If you were to take away one thing from this presentation, it is awareness. Emotion and motivation are proven to be highly variable, not only among cultures, but also among individuals. Being able to adapt a classroom and environment and the lesson to fit a student's need is really important, especially for younger students. The purpose of understanding cultural implications and learning is not to stereotype or to categorize students. It's to understand the variability and the fluidity necessary to implement in a classroom setting. Awareness is the key here. Educators need to be aware of the differences and the uniqueness of each student, and researchers need to be aware of the need for more cross-cultural and inclusive work. Ultimately, the goal is to provide equitable educational opportunities and outcomes to students and access to culturally sensitive education that prepares them for a future, no matter their background. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.